Welcome to the Cult of Domesticity podcast, a podcast about history, true crime, and whatever life brings us. I'm Courtney, and every week I am joined by another fascinating person. Let's see what we're going to talk about this week.
So, hello, friends. We're back. Well, I'm back.
Yay.
And Linzi's here from 33% Pulp. So that's exciting.
Hello! I'm excited.
Yes. I was going to say, hopefully by now I've recorded my little, break thing to say, hey, this is what's going on. But who knows? Who knows? Motivation-wise.
It'll happen. It'll get done, or it won't, and then it'll be fine. You know.
So yes, Linzi is here to tell us a story, since you guys are done with your second season, and now I'm sad, because I just listened to the Pulpies and agreed with everything this morning. I was like, yeah, that.
Yes, the Pulpies. For my podcast, 33% Pulp, we, at the end of each season, we do this, award ceremony for, the best villain or something, for the 5 books that we covered in that season. Oh, so my podcast, we divide a pulp novel into thirds, and my friend Daniel and I, and then a guest host, will read a third of the book, and then over 3 episodes, we tell each other the story. And so, yeah, the Pulpies come at the end of the season after 5 books, and we honor, the best supporting villain and the worst night out and things like that. So that was a fun episode. And then coming up we have season 3, and that'll be exciting. I'm pumped for it. We have some cool stuff ahead. Yeah. In addition to this, which is also cool, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. This was planned way ahead of time before the incident. It's exciting that everyone's being so loving and supporting, which is awesome.
Of course.
I have to say,
you do good stuff here.
Thank you. I was very upset with the ending of the last book. It just kind of ended, and I was like, wait, what? It's done?
Yeah. Daniel felt the same way. And we've actually gotten a listener request to, instead of having a 99-word flash fiction contest this year, to have some kind of contest where people can submit new endings to books. Because, yeah, the last book that we read, The Infinitive of Go, kind of just ended. It literally ended with an ellipsis. So that was disappointing.
Yeah. Especially with...
Yeah.
It was a very interesting book in many regards. Especially considering...
I loved it.
It was good.
I loved it. Yeah.
I do like that one of the characters' name was Cinnamon, and she got to be a scientist. It's like, let's get some ethnicity up in here in tech positions. So it was nice. But yes. Yeah,
so Cinnamon was a really cool African-American scientist that was superb in every way, although during sex her face melted. That was concerning, but besides that.
When that happens.
When that happens.
Do you want to go first, or would you like me to go first?
I can go first.
Okay.
I'm doing the Donner Party.
Yes.
And there was a book called Ordeal by Hunger. And so I have a little title that I would show you in the camera if we were on camera, but I have a title for my little script of notes here. It's Ordeal by Hanger, hangry. I thought that was funny. I don't know. Maybe that's just funny to me.
That's a good one.
But for those of you who don't know, the general overview is, and I'll get more into the details in a minute, of course, but the general overview is during the Great Migration West / expansionist Manifest Destiny era, this group of families tried to go from Springfield, Illinois to California. And what happened was they tried to take a shortcut, and they got delayed, and then they got snowed in, and then they were just there in the snow for a very long time. And there was some survival cannibalism. A lot of history books will talk of the Donner Party and kind of not fetishize, but kind of exaggerate how much the survival cannibalism There was, but what was really interesting to me as I was researching this for the podcast was all of the other factors like race and nation and class that played into the psychological relationships among the like 80 some people in this party. It's not just one family, it's several families. So,
oh yeah. Let's get into that American mixing pot. Let's just stir it all up.
Yes. So, during the 1840s, the United States saw a dramatic increase in pioneers or settlers or, U.S. colonizers who left their homes to in the East to settle in Oregon and California, which is where we both are, right?
Well, I'm just north of Oregon. I went to Oregon to get gas today and groceries because I need to eat food, and there's no sales tax, state sales tax in Oregon. Fun fact. So it's cheaper.
That is super, because in California there definitely is sales tax. So a joke at the time was that a California man approached the gates of heaven, and the Archangel Gabriel advised him to go back because California is a heap better country than this, that being heaven. But this whole philosophy of manifest destiny was basically all over the place, that these European Americans can go wherever, and they just needed to tame the land, the frontier. They needed to settle it, and then they can have it for themselves somehow, and without regard to the people who were already there. But those people.
There were people here. What? Never. Europeans don't like to put flags on things.
There was an incident where, because California wasn't a part of the country yet, right? It was just territory owned by Mexico, I think. And at some point during this whole ordeal, they raised a flag and it looked like a pig. And so the people indigenous to the land they were like, why the fuck are they raising this fabric with a pig on it? And it was supposed to be a bear, a California bear.
Oh my god. Yeah. That's great. That's great. Yes, let's get the pig bear up.
In 1842, Lansford Hastings, an early immigrant from Ohio to the West.
Woo woo!
Ohio, woo! He ends up being kind of sketchy, but it's okay. So he published this book called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. This was a massive book that inspired a lot of people to head west. And it was basically a guide. So go here and then here, and you can get your stuff here, right? Super handy. This was also around the time that President Polk, James K. Polk, decided to manifest his own destiny to annex Mexican territory that would become California, New Mexico, and Arizona. The Mexican-American War began in 1846 and serves as a backdrop to the whole story. So the Donner Party, on their journey, didn't really encounter this so much, but it did hold back one person from going to rescue them by 4 months. And so that does play a role.
Yeah, that would help. Yeah, if there's a war going on, I could go help these people, but there's a war near me.
Right. Well, dangerous. That said, they did not miss the native Shoshone in Utah and Nevada, the Northern Paiute, and the Miwok tribes. They actually encountered several tribes along their way from Springfield, Illinois to California. That particular year, there's a historian who counted the deaths, murders, between the immigrants and the native people. And that year, this historian, I forget his name, said this is admittedly imprecise, but he counted, I think it was 4 murders of, immigrants. Sorry, excuse me, the indigenous, which, I don't know.
Seems low.
That seems low. Seems low.
Seems real low.
But in addition to race, culture, and religion and nation, class was significant as well, because what is typically referred to as the single Donner Party was in fact several families, and then at some point 2 Miwok guides, Luis and Salvador. Yes, there were 2 guides at some point.
They probably picked him up along the way. They're like, please help us. We don't know. We're lost. And so won't ask for directions. and we really need directions.
They did not ask for directions, and that was significant and pretty bad for them.
They didn't have Google Maps?
They didn't have Google Maps or like aerial view or anything, because that would have also been useful. If they could see where they were going, they probably wouldn't be going the way that they went.
Darn it.
On April 16th, 1846, 9 brand new covered wagons rattled slowly out of Springfield and headed west. So typically the trip took 5 months if you went by sea, and 4 if you went overland. But for many in this group, the trip would take like about a year. So
they Lewis and Clark that shit.
They did. Actually, there was a lot of like Lewis and Clark references in the books that I read. By the time they left Independence, Missouri, about a month and 250 miles later, they were a part of a 500 wagon caravan. And because you had to be kind of rich to travel, all but a few lacked specific skills and experience in traveling the mountains and like arid land, and none of them had any knowledge of Native Americans. So these were all like super rich people who were like, yeah, like I could do this. Like they went to REI or whatever, and they got their like sleeping bags, and they were like, good to go, you know.
I got some food. I got a gun. I got a wagon. What else am I missing? Survival skills. That's the big thing.
Right, exactly. That's what they didn't have. And they just assumed, oh, we'll just, stay with the wagon train and everything will be fine. And neither of those things ended up being true. So there were two main families. There were the Donners, which were like 22 people about.
Shit.
And the Reed family, which was 12 people about. And then there were other families. One that I noted was led by Levina Murphy, who was a widow and 37 years old. She led a group of 13 people in this train. And then notably, the last one that I want to kind of pull out is Louis Keseberg, who joined with his wife, Elizabeth Philippine. I kind of pull him out because he comes up at the very end, but during their travels, a man called James Breen, who was traveling as well, called Keseberg a tall and powerful, quick-tempered, and easily irritable man. A number of them noted that Keseberg seemed to be abusive to his wife Philippine, who had just given birth to their first son. Some of them said that he was an outright wife-beater. Virginia Reed, 12 at the time, wrote that Philippine Keseberg was a humble and unassuming woman who was cowed down. He treated her like a brute. She was afraid of him, and yet made all sorts of excuses for him, end quote. So this is by 1846 standards. Like this man and this girl were like, that's like a lot. That's a lot what he just happened. So they traveled the Oregon Trail from Independence, Missouri, going about at this point in time 15 miles a day.
Not bad.
On a journey that took not terrible for like a group of 60-some wagons or whatever. And this usually took about 4 months. The most difficult part of it was the last 100 miles, and they knew this because they had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains.
Yeah, they're pretty big.
That particular mountain... Yeah, that particular mountain range has 500 peaks, each over 12,000 feet, or 3,700 meters, I guess, high. I almost said miles. That's not true.
I mean, I think I've seen enough of them now. I just see the mountains all the time. I'm just like, man, a lot of mountains out here. There's some more mountains.
Yeah.
Some more mountains. Mountains.
More mountains than in Ohio, I bet.
Yeah, there's no mountains. Unless you get towards like Pittsburgh area, then there's some mountains.
So they knew that at the very end it was going to be the hardest because it was like steep on the east side of the range and snowy at the top, and then it's just going to be a shitty route. So aware of this, James Reed was excited to read Lansford Hastings' letter. He had sent these letters or left these letters at these forts along the way saying, hey, I worked out a new and better road to California, and said that he would be waiting at Fort Bridger to guide the emigrants through the new cutoff or like shortcut.
No. So
by July, after a good 3 months of travel, the wagons were in Fort Laramie celebrating Independence Day. What?
Woo! I've been there.
Yeah?
Wyoming?
Fort Laramie?
Yeah, we stayed there.
Yeah. Wow, you did go the Oregon Trail.
A little bit. I just took 80 most of the way
That's so
across
cool.
the country, so I think it's part of it. There were signs.
Yeah, definitely. There was a lot, because I had to look at maps to understand, like, where these landmarks are, and it does, like, follow the 80, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So they rested there, but soon they were facing slow, muddy terrain, and the wagon wheels were sinking into the ground, leading to speeds of 2 miles a day.
Ooh.
And the temperature hovered around 102 degrees for 6 straight days.
Ugh.
So people were getting fussy.
Yeah.
But onward they went to meet up with Hastings at Fort Bridger in Black's Fork. So here's the thing. Although Hastings had sent and left all these letters and notes like, hey, I'm going to meet you in like Fort, whatever it's called, Bridger. Just come meet me and I got this way, whatever. He had never actually gone that way with wagons, which is significantly different than just a solo guy with a horse or whatever. So
Really well planned out.
yeah, a real piece of work, this guy. Fort Bridger also was run by Jim Bridger and his partner Pierre Louis Vasquez in Black's Fork, Wyoming. This guy, Edwin Bryant, had reached there, knew that like the Donner Party was going to follow Hastings, right, down this route, and he started ahead of them, and he was like, there is no fucking way, like all those wagons can make this. So this guy, Edwin Bryant went backtracked to the fort and was like, hey, you need to tell these people do not go this way because it makes no sense for them. They're going to have like such a difficult time, right? And turns out, so the guy who was in charge of the fort, like it would be better for him if they went that way because then they would buy more supplies. So he did not pass along this message to the Donner Party. And then they just kind of followed Hastings down this way that was fairly untried for wagons. Yeah, there's like no water. It's rugged country. Oh, excuse me. He told the party that this is the shortcut. This is what the Donner Party was told, was a smooth trip with water all along the way, devoid of rugged country and hostile Native Americans, and would therefore shorten their journey by 370 miles.
Can I call bullshit?
So it's bullshit. But to be fairish, like they had been following this original route since April, and they had been making good time. Even though that there had been like a few weather delays, the hardest part, as Tamzine Donner, George's wife, like kind of the matriarch of the whole thing, she was like, oh, the hardest part is in starting. This is a pleasant journey, right? So it's at this like crucial point where they decide, okay, we will go on this new untried route, right? That puts them where they end up. So they leave Fort Bridger. And this route would ultimately add 150 miles to their journey. Further, because literally like no wagons had gone that way, there was no clear path to take. So when necessary, the men were cutting brush and trees and moving rocks to pave the way, which slowed their pace to 1.5 miles a day.
It seems real faster, moving 1.5 miles a day. So fast. Plus you added
Can
miles.
you imagine? Like you could like look back and be like, we were there yesterday. I mean, God, that must be so depressing. Plus it was super hot. It was super hot at this point. I think I read like it was even hotter than before. It was like 106 degrees at this point.
That's too hot.
So everybody is getting pretty worried because they know that if, they need to make good time so that they don't get caught in the mountains, right? And so they're like starting to get real anxious. They're now at the Wasatch Mountains. As the Donner Party made its way across them, they were caught up by, the Graves family caught up with them. So this kind of indicates, too, how slowly they were going because they had to clear the way. And here, this whole other family came up and, like, caught up with them because they had cleared that path, right? So it kind of shows how slow they were going.
Yeah.
So Graves family caught up with them. And so now with the Graves family, they have 87 people in, 70 wagons.
A lot of wagons.
So it was August 20th. It's a lot of dang wagons. Oh, P.S. I didn't note this. I don't know why it's gone from my script, but the Reed family, first of all, Reed was apparently like friends with Abraham Lincoln and had a lot of money from lead mining. And his wagon, his main wagon, was like 2 stories tall and was called the Pioneer Palace. And it had like this indoor oven stove thing in it. And it was like basically like an RV or something. And so people were actually his class and his general demeanor, like, oh, I'm better than you or whatever, created a lot of issues among the group members, which we will see in a minute, but his class was definitely part of that.
Can you imagine pushing a 2-story wagon up a mountain?
No, I can't. And they eventually start to leave them, but like even the regular wagons, so they do crazy things just to keep these dang wagons. So, I mean, well, obviously, because it's got everything they own in it, but still. So they get to the top and they're looking out. It's August 20th. They're at the top of the Wasatch Mountain. They're looking out and they're like, oh my God, we have more desert to cross. And it's like twice as much as we just went. So they are arguing. It says doubts were expressed. So yeah, they're arguing, and the food and supplies at this point is around August 20th began to run out for some of the less affluent families. So now they're in the Great Salt Lake Desert. After 36 hours, they set off to traverse a 1,000-foot mountain that lay in their path. They see, quote, one of the most inhospitable places on earth, unquote. And at this point, their oxen were already fatigued and their water was nearly gone.
Oh, shit.
Which is bad times. So the party pressed onward on August 30th. Because what else are you going to do? Like, you can't cross the mountains back. In the heat of the day, the moisture underneath the salt crust rose to the surface and turned the soil into a gummy mass.
Ew.
The wheels of their wagons sank into it, sometimes up to the wheel hub. So they are going so slow. And, like, imagine all these animals that are, like, out of water and pulling these dang wagons. The days were hot and the nights were cold. They would use every piece of clothing they had and then put their dogs on top for warmth at night. Because they had a couple dogs. They had one dog called Cash and another one called Towser. So here's some details about, like, their hygiene, which didn't exist. Because no one had clean water to drink for sometimes over a week at this period of time.
Ugh.
Yeah. If it happened at all, a bath would be had in a shallow, muddy, sulfurous, alkaline stream. Meanwhile, so like they smell like it's not good.
You smell like you came out of hell?
Meanwhile, yeah, like you came out of hell or like a rotten egg but it gets worse. Oh my God. So actually there's like ton that I just never thought of. So meanwhile, they quickly ran out of clean water to launder with, right? Because of course, any clean water you have, you're going to drink. So their clothes and bedding became worse than smelly. They became infested with lice, bed bugs, and fleas.
Nope.
They smelled like sweat, urine, excrement, halitosis, yeast infections, and menstrual blood. Because the women, like, there's just no hygiene. They had torn up or used all the fabric they had during patch repairs on clothing on the wagons, so women didn't have the means to tend to their time of the month. Toothbrushes were a rarity, not patented.
I was gonna say, could you imagine the worst time to have your period than, like, if after you ran out of cloths and stuff and you can't even clean them? Oh.
No. And you're out of water and food and you're looking at each other like, why are we here in the desert in the middle of nowhere?
And then you're like, it's hot and you have cramps and you're just like wanting to die in the wagon. Yeah.
It can't, well, and it's around this point, well, they start to leave people behind. But their toothbrushes aren't a thing. Mm-hmm. They weren't patented until 1857. And they weren't mass-produced until the 1880s, so it wasn't uncommon to have rotten teeth. This was like a normal thing. But in their journals, they were like, our teeth are rotting. So even for those standards, their teeth were like not in good shape. So at this point, they start to leave some of their wagons and oxen behind because they just can't pull anymore. The cattle and oxen were now exhausted and lean. But the Donner Party crossed the next stretch of desert relatively unscathed. So September 26th, 2 months after embarking on the cutoff, the Donner Party rejoined the traditional trail along a stream that became known as the Humboldt River.
Okay.
So the shortcut, quote unquote, probably delayed them by a month. In other words, they were a month closer to winter and with a month's deficit of rations and like physical energy. And they had been like leaving oxen and wagons along the way.
That's not good.
So not good. Not good. So remember they like started in April, like mid-April. So October 5th, James Reed killed 25-year-old John Snyder. Apparently like their wagons got caught up in each other. Like they had a wagon crash or something. And, like they start arguing, remember, and a lot of people don't like this James Reed guy because he's the rich guy, and John Snyder they just picked up randomly at the like last fort or something. And John Snyder apparently used the butt of his gun to hit James Reed, and possibly by some reports they said that he hit Margaret Reed, James Reed's wife. So James Reed like lunged and like plunged a knife into John Snyder's chest, and it killed him. So everybody's like, oh fuck, what do we do now? Because we're in the middle of this desert and this guy just killed this guy, and now what? Like, we can't have this murderer here. And this other guy like has a noose and he wants to hang him and everything. And they are like, no, let's just calm down. How about we banish him? So they banish him. They give him a horse and they're like, bye, like go away.
Bye, bitch.
They didn't give him any food or like weapons or anything, but his daughter somehow like snuck out and rode ahead and caught up with him and gave him like food and a gun. So he's gone.
He's worse off than Captain Jack Sparrow being left with a gun.
Well, but in the same sense as like Jack Sparrow kind of like always is going to be okay, I feel. Like this actually was a good thing for everybody because that meant that James Reed could just go in his horse and go ahead of all these people with the wagons and the children, you know, and the dying oxen. So he could make fairly good time. He actually made it to safety around October. Like that same month, he made it to like safety. So. And he's the guy who like got caught up in the war and couldn't head back for 4 months because he was caught up in the war, I guess. Battle of Santa Clara. Back in like the wagon caravan, like what happened was just a symptom of or like a flare up of what was generally happening. People were angry, people were upset, people were hungry, like they were hangry, right?
Yeah.
So at this point, to relieve some of the weight from the oxens, they tell everybody, like everybody has to walk. So the children, the women who had been riding in the wagons, they have to walk to relieve some of the weight for the animals. They leave a couple people behind. They're old people that they're like, if you can't. Louis Keseberg, the guy who beats his wife, said to this older man, he was like, if you're just dead weight, and he kicked him out of his wagon and left him behind.
What a dick.
So he's, not the nicest guy, but I don't know. It's tough because it's like, what, that particular guy, I think he's an asshole, but I mean, it's tough because like, fuck, what do you do?
What do you do? Like, do you leave the old people behind? Do you let them like stay on the wagon and slow you down? But do you like,
yeah, because he can't, like, add anything because he was so old. He was too frail. He couldn't walk, right? So he couldn't add any labor or do anything. And so it's like he's just, like, dead weight. And it's just unfortunate. Super sad. So faced with one last push over the mountains that were described as much worse than the Wasatch, right? This is the Sierra Nevada that everybody's afraid of. They decide to pull over and pull the wagons over and rest for a minute. It was, it's not a good idea because it's the October 20th and, they were told that the pass would not be snowed in until the middle of November. Okay. So they're like, okay, we have a day or two to like relax. Let's rest our bodies. Right. And then we'll plow through the Sierra Nevada as fast as we can. At the same time, their supplies were so diminished that they ate their dogs. Isn't that so sad? I mean, that's so sad, I think. They ate Cash and Towser.
You gotta do what you gotta do, but it makes you sad.
So October 20th, they're like, okay, we'll be fine if we just, like, rest up and then do a solid push, right? Unfortunately, snowfall came early that year. So they're facing a massive, nearly vertical slope of 1,000 feet to Truckee Lake, which is now known as Donner Lake, right? So how the hell are they going to get all their shit up this like 1,000-foot like wall?
Hopes and dreams. hopes and dreams will get them up there.
Yeah, so they at this particular lake, which they ended up getting to, I didn't, I guess, include how they got there. So what they ended up doing is they took the animals individually up there and then had like, I don't know, ropes or chains or something, and then had the like animals like pull the wagons up the wall. Because there's no way that the wagons could go through the pass. Yeah. It was intense. So there was a few cabins around this lake that were there from a couple groups. Like the prior year, these other white people like built them, and so they were like, "Cool, there's cabins." So a bunch of the groups made it up to the lake, but the Donner Party couldn't make it, so they ended up being like a half day away from the other people. But this accounts for, like, if you see any of the maps, like this accounts for like why there's a few cabins around a lake and then the Donner Party is kind of off in the distance, and you're like, why? I thought they were all together. Well, they just couldn't make it up this cliff. So, winter camp. The winter of 1846 was unusually cold across the entire northern hemisphere. In Oregon, the Columbia River had frozen over.
Shit. It's a big river. It's a big river. I see it. I see the map of it every day. It's a big river. Like, for that to freeze? Fuck.
I think one of the things that I read said it was the coldest winter on record.
I believe it.
In Nebraska, more than 600 people died due to blizzards. Charlotte Bronte in Yorkshire, England, wrote, "The cold here is dreadful. I do not remember such a series of North Pole days. England might really have taken a slide up into the Arctic zone. The sky looks like ice. The earth is frozen. The wind is as keen as a two-edged knife." And so also, this is the same year, like if you've seen the TV show The Terror on AMC with the two ships that they're like, oh, we're going to find the passage from England to China. We're going to go just over the Arctic or whatever the hell. Passage. Find the Northern Passage. Yeah. Northwest Passage. Obviously, well, not obviously, they didn't make it, spoiler, alert, but yeah. Everybody is suffering in this crazy winter of 1846.
And they never found the Northwest Passage. No one found it. Everyone looked.
They never did. Also, something that I read is where they ended up staying is not too far from where Walt Disney eventually bought Sugar Bowl, I guess, which is a ski place. And the reason why he bought it and made it into a ski place is because on average, every winter it gets 41 inches of snow. Something like this. So they are just all kinds of fucked, They're in the middle of nowhere. No one is around.
No one knows they're there.
So no one knows they're there because they're completely isolated. So around December 16th, or on December 16th, of that year, they sent a party of 17 people out. A couple come straight back and they're like, oh, never mind. I don't want to. They're like, go find help for us. The people that came back was this guy who brought a young boy back because he was only 10 or 11. And he was like, oh, you are definitely not going to make it. So he brought him back to the camp.
That's a good person.
Yeah. So, as evidence of how grim their choices were, 4 of the men were fathers and 3 of the women mothers who gave their young children to other women. So among them was Amanda McCutcheon, who left her newborn baby Sarah behind. And we'll come back to Sarah in a minute. They packed lightly, taking what had become 6 days' rations. So they had food for 6 days, a rifle, a blanket, a hatchet, and some pistols. So later historian Charles McGlashan would call this party the Forlorn Hope. They had made snowshoes, which were effective but awkward because it wasn't the snowshoes so much, but it was that the snow that they were in was 12 feet deep. Oh, maybe it's not 41 inches, maybe it's 41 feet. That would make more sense, I think. So, because the snow that they were walking in was 12 feet deep.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot of snow.
It's a dang lot of snow. And rendered many of them snowblind by the 3rd day. On the 6th day, William Eddy discovered that his wife had hidden a half-pound of bear meat in his pack. Yay! Aww. So the group set out again the morning of December 21st, but the group quickly became lost and confused. After 2 more days of food, Patrick Dolan proposed that one of them should volunteer to die to feed the others. No one wanted to volunteer, So they drew straws because they were like, yeah, we're all starving. No one wanted to do this. I mean, they had been starving at this point for months, right? Dolan himself ended up drawing the shortest straw and was like, never mind. That was a bad idea.
I regret my choice to offer this, as I am now the one who will be dying for you. I regret everything.
Yeah, I thought it might have been one of the other people, and it wasn't. So Eddie kept suggesting that they just continue until the next person died, and then they maybe would eat that person. But the blizzard had forced the group to halt. Like, they couldn't go any further. So Antonio, the animal handler, died, and then Franklin Graves was the next death. So they have not, by the time, right around this time, which is what, the 20th or something of December, they hadn't eaten anybody. A lot of people, when the Donner Party comes up, they're like, oh, they ate each other. I want to give a little bit of just other kinds of context. So there are biblical accounts of cannibalism, 10th century accounts of Christian crusaders eating captured Arabs, and widespread accounts of other kinds of religious cannibalism among indigenous peoples of South America, Polynesia, and North America. In contrast, survival cannibalism pops up during times of great famine when there are no other alternatives. So in 1920s Ukraine, so many bodies were disappearing from the streets because I guess there was a famine.
Yes, the Holodomor. The Holodomor was a Russian-induced famine. Because Ukraine is actually the breadbasket of the region, and the Russian Soviet government said kept making them give all the grain. So, yeah, if you keep giving away all the grain, there's no grain.
There's nothing to eat. So, local authorities posted signs that read, "Eating dead children is barbarism." So it's not like they want to, you know?
Yeah.
But during the 900-day siege of Leningrad from 1941 to 44, local rations led to mass starvation, and then in that particular case, some instances of cannibalism. During China's Great Leap Forward, a time in which some 35 million people starved to death, there were many reports of cannibalism in the smaller villages where they would, exchange bodies. So if someone died, they would give the body to the village next village over, and then vice versa, so that they didn't have to eat anybody that they actually knew.
That's kind of considerate.
And that was actually what they did in the Donner Party. Like, these people, like, in so many movies, like, I saw this, like, movie called Donner's Pass. Not recently, actually, but it was a while back, because I just am kind of fascinated by the Donner Party. But they represented them as, like, these, this is offensive, but I mean, it's like hillbillies, you know, like, these people who are ignorant and just, like, crazy and starved for human flesh. And it's like, they weren't like that, actually. And they went for a very long time. They were just, you know, nice white aristocrat colonizers that ate each other. Okay, but back at the camp, it's Christmas. And Margaret Reed had secretly squirreled away a small stash of supplies, too small under normal conditions to even make a meal, but large enough now to constitute a feast. It was a few dried apples, a few beans, a little tripe, and one small piece of bacon. So the kids were like, oh my God, and it was so good, and they felt so spoiled. They said it was the best Christmas ever because of their conditions, and then seeing this, it was a lot. Unfortunately, only a couple days later, they had to begin eating the oxide that served as their roof. So now, without reasonable shelter from the winter storms, the family had split up into other people's cabins. The family was, like, not together anymore. Peggy Breen couldn't help but slip some of the Reed children some food, but she saw it more as, like, a way to ease their suffering as opposed to, like, extend their life. And she actually at some point pulled Margaret Reed aside and was like, maybe you should kill them. Like, maybe that would be the compassionate thing to do.
Yeah.
Right? So, back at the forlorn crew, the people who had left earlier. Patrick Dolan, the guy who was like, hey, maybe we should eat each other, never mind, he began to rant deliriously. He stripped off his clothes and ran into the woods. He returned shortly afterwards and died a few hours later. So, apparently these are like symptoms of hypothermia.
Yeah.
Like being too cold.
You get too cold and then your brain thinks you're too warm, so then you strip because you're like, I'm fine. But your body's really shutting down. Super counterintuitive, but your body is just freaking out. So everybody in the party who was still alive ate his
body, except for William, Eddie, Salvador, and Luis, the two Miwok guides, Salvador and Luis. They did not partake. So this is December 27th, months after they began slowly starving to death. So why now, when they had been without food for 6 days at most, why did they start eating? And people don't really know, like eating each other, people don't really know, like, why that particular time, but it's probably having to do with like the psychological toll of starvation and being in the wilderness and people dying that you know, you've been traveling with for months and they're dying around you. And so they're like, just overwhelmed by everything.
They might have also said, if I die, use me as subsistence so you can live.
Yeah, actually, you're totally right. Actually, there were a lot of people who were like, if they said that, they volunteered, they were like, when I die, I want you to like, just take my meat, you know, and eat. So to be clear, no one ate their family members. They cut strips of flesh so thin that they couldn't tell it was human, carefully labeled, and or separated the meat so no one would have to eat a family member. That said, they were like still super ashamed and felt guilty about it. And like they're in every account, they said that they like wouldn't make eye contact with each other as they ate.
I mean, that's fair.
So like, yeah.
It's reluctant cannibalism. It's not like rejoice, like they're not enjoying it.
Yeah. It's just to survive. So Eddie, who had previously said that he wasn't going to eat people, he had to eventually start partaking. They began to take apart their snowshoes and eat the oxhide webbing and discuss killing Luis and Salvador, their Miwok guides, for food. But Eddie had warned the two men and they quietly left. He was like, hey, these guys, they want to murder you to eat you, so probably go. Which is super unfortunate because they were the only two people who kind of knew the land, right? So they left. Another guy dies. They eat him. Okay. Oh, so this I want to go back to, like, civilization, quote unquote. So around this time, the Illinois Gazette wrote this article, Rules for Wives. A good wife will always receive her husband with smiles, leaving nothing undone to render home agreeable and gratefully reciprocate kindness and attention. She will study to discover means to gratify his inclinations in regard to food and cooking, in the management of her family, in her dress, manner, and deportment. She will, in everything, reasonably comply with his wishes, and, as far as possible, anticipate them.
Ugh.
So this is like what's happening at the time where other people live, actually. And there were, just as a side note to my side note, there were rules for husbands. A good husband will always regard his wife as his equal, which I thought was progressive for 1846. Treat her with kindness, respect, and attention, and never address her with an air of authority as if she were, as some husbands appear to regard their wives, mere housekeepers. So I thought that was like an interesting kind of, oh, this is what's happening where people are, and there are newspapers. Meanwhile, to a large extent, the Forlorn Hope crew were barefoot now, their shoes having disintegrated or having been eaten, and the shreds of the blanket in which they were, so they had wrapped their feet in the blanket, and now that was beginning to disintegrate. By the time they reached the bottom of the canyon, their feet, already cracked and swollen, had been lacerated by the sharp rocks of the canyon wall. Their clothes had been burned through in places from crowding too close to their nightly fires. Their garments were so tattered that neither the women nor the men could even begin to maintain their modesty any longer. Thighs and breasts and buttocks peeked out from under the miserable rags that hung limply from their shoulders. So they're pretty dang haggard, and like it's been fucking months since they've had any kind of real meal or anything.
Yeah.
So several more days, 25 since they left the lake, the main camp, they came across Salvador and Luis, who had not eaten for about 9 days and were close to death. So at this point, William Foster shot them, believing that their flesh was the group's last hope of avoiding imminent death from starvation. So now they shot the two people who had been leading them through the wilderness. Back at the camp, 1-year-old Harriet McCutcheon and I have here, I don't know how she's still alive at this point because she's only 1 year old.
Yeah.
And her mom, remember, Amanda McCutcheon is part of this Forlorn Hope crew. She has lice.
Oh.
So the baby had scratched until she bled. So the Graves family, which had been looking after her, tied her arms to her sides. And the baby then continued to, like, just scream relentlessly. And Patty Reed, like, said that it haunted her forever. Just the baby's screams as the baby was, like, tied up and so that she wouldn't scratch herself anymore.
I believe that would be haunting. That's the stuff of nightmares.
That would be... Yes, that's so sad. I just imagined this tiny baby, like, all tied up. Ugh. So on January 12th, the group stumbled into a Miwok camp. So this is only a few days after they killed Luis and Salvador. It was just a couple days after them. And then they stumbled into a Miwok camp, which was the tribe that Luis and Salvador came from. And the Miwok people, when they got there, they saw this group of people who were just haggard as fuck. And they're like, oh, holy shit. And initially they like ran away from them because they were like, there's fucking monsters coming from the mountain, right?
Yeah.
But this particular tribe gave them what they had to eat. So they ate some acorns, grass, and pine nuts. After a few days at their camp, Eddie continued on to a ranch in a small farming community and hurriedly assembled a rescue party who got the other 6 survivors from the Miwok camp that had been taking care of them. P.S. Their journey from the Truckee Lake had taken 33 days. And remember, they had left with 6 days rations.
Damn.
But this was the start of the rescue. Yay! So first rescue trip back. So this is Eddie, William Eddy. By the time Eddie's team made it back, everything was covered in snow. Like, the cabins, there was the equivalent of 2 stories worth of snow. The cabins were completely submerged. So they didn't see anybody. They didn't see any even buildings. So they were like, hello! That's how it's spelled out. H-A, like, multiple L's, multiple O's. Hello! And so then some, like, buddy, like, crawls out of the snow. And this is like a big thing that's in all the books. Lavina Murphy says, "Are you men from California or do you come from heaven?" Because they had been delirious. They had been hallucinating, you know? They had not eaten. The relief party doled out food in small portions, concerned that it might kill them if the emaciated emigrants overate. 23 people were chosen to go with the rescue party, leaving 21 in the cabins at Truckee Lake and 12 at Alder Creek. That's back where the Donner Party was, remember, because it kind of separated.
Yeah.
So they made it back, but William Hook, this is maybe one of the sadder deaths too. William Hook, who was 12 years old after surviving all of this, he made it to, you know, quote unquote civilization, back where there's like people, and broke into food stores and overate himself to death because his body couldn't handle all the food.
Oh.
Isn't that super sad?
It's sad, but it's also very much a 12-year-old boy thing to do.
Yeah. He, like, broke in and was like, oh my god, like, I imagine, like, some, like, the kid in Willy Wonka. But, I mean, that's horrible. I mean, because that was real life, and that was a movie.
Oh, Augustus Gloop, who falls into the river. He Augustus Glooped himself to death.
Blueberry lady, right? Is that not...
Oh, Violet, yes. Violet, you're turning violet!
So then... there's James Reed, too, remember, who had been banished and, like, was delayed because of the Mexican-American War. So he came and evacuated 17 people, only 3 of whom were adults. So most of them were kids. And then on the way back, the second... this is super... I was like, oh my god, that's so fucking graphic. 5-year-old Isaac Donner froze to death and Reed nearly died. Mary Donner's feet were badly burned because they were so frostbitten that she didn't realize she was sleeping with them in the fire.
Oh my gosh.
So intense. So then how the hell is she going to continue? I don't know. When the storm passed, the Breen and Graves families were too apathetic and exhausted to get up and move, having not eaten for days. The relief party had no choice but to leave without them. So at this point, there had been 2 rescue trips, right? So that one by Eddie and one by James Reed. And so then there's a third trip, which is, they're going back and they're going to get the kids and everything. So they got the rest of the people there, except for, because George Donner, you know, the man this is like who the party was named after, like, will not be abandoned by Tamsin Donner, who's like the get shit done lady who has diaried the whole time and like journaled the whole time. Right. So they're like, that probably won't come back for you at this point. Like, you should come with us. And she's like, I'm not abandoning my husband. So they leave. Now, other people come, and this is when, meanwhile, at this point, after the first rescue party, like, news reports started coming out. Oh my God, these people were eating everybody, and these are like barbarians, savages, and this is where a lot of the Donner Party cannibalism, like, comes from. That said, the Keysburg guy, the wife beater / old man abandoner, was there, and when a bunch of people came back, they saw him surrounded by a bunch of bodies, and including the one of Tamsin Donner. So there was a whole like jury or whatever, a case, trial, whatever it's called, and they ended up saying, okay, it was probably survival cannibalism, but he became kind of like the image or the face of the Donner Party, unfortunately, because he was just surrounded by bodies and had like sucked out brains of women and stuff. So that was what stuck. Yeah. Oh, and apparently like liver, if you're ever stuck in the like wilderness, you gotta eat the liver first, because that'll go bad. Liver and heart go bad, and brains have to be sucked out.
Yeah, you gotta eat the organs first.
Yeah. The other stuff will stay, apparently. I'm a vegetarian. So I'm like, okay, well, good to know, I guess. I hope I never need this.
Don't go hiking ever.
Tell people where you're going all the time. Of the 87 members of the party, 48 survived to reach California, many of them having eaten the dead for survival. So 28 men died and only 8 women. And a lot of people are like, how did that happen? Why are so many men dying? And so some people will say, well, it's because the men had more physical labor to do, because they had to like cut those trees down and cut the brush and like do things with the oxen or whatever. And then the counterpoint is, well, women had to do a lot of things too. They had to like wash the clothes. They had to take care of things. They were walking alongside the men at some point, and they very much were equal at the end, doing everything that the men were doing. So then biologically, male bodies need more calories than female bodies, which can subsist longer because their bodies tend to retain more fat, especially when going into starvation mode, I guess. And then among the ones that died, it tended to be the youngest and the oldest that died. Okay, of the people who died in their 20s, it tended to only be single men.
Huh.
Only one of the men in their 20s, which is William Eddy, the guy who like saved a bunch of people, lived. The other 7 men in their 20s died. And so people speculate that it was because they were traveling alone as hired hands. So they had more physical labor to do and none of the familial or social connections, because they were just hired help, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Relationally, the people who survived were well connected. And so I thought that this was in a book, and I was like, oh, that could be read in so many ways. It says, people are good for people. Which I thought could be like, you know, for the Donner Party story. Well, okay, I guess. And that's the story of the Donner Party.
Woo! Terrifying.
Yay.
The Donners, they all just kind of died because they didn't eat, like the last group?
Yeah. So, and like during one of the first trips or the second trips, Tamsin was like, please take my kids. And these 2 guys were like, sure. One of them had the last name of Stone, and they were like, sure, we'll take your kids. And they were like, wait, these kids aren't going to make it. And so they like left her kids at the other camp. So she found out and was like, the hell? Like, and she went and saw her kids that had been left behind, and she was like, I hope someone takes you. And she went back to George, and those kids actually ended up surviving, but it was super sad because they don't remember what she looks like. They don't remember what the parents look like. Yeah, but the two families survived like all together, I think. The Reed family survived, like the whole Reed family.
Dang.
And then another family survived, which was, I mean, obviously, given you hear the story, it's like, that's pretty impressive. Yeah, I just think it's interesting, because of course, like, I heard this when I was probably in middle school or something, and I was like, oh my god, cannibals, right?
Yeah.
But as you get deeper into it, there's so many different factors having to do with like, and I maybe didn't cover this as much, but like the indigenous people at some point during the desert, like people were laughing at them. They heard people laughing at them, the Donner Party, which were, the indigenous people. Probably
because they were traveling during the day. Like, your best bet for a desert is at night.
Like, what are you doing?
Like, what? Really? You're choosing this path? Really? You're choosing this path? Good job, people.
Like, it's not even a path that that people who aren't, like, land illiterate would recognize, right? So they're just fucking going westward. They're like, let's go west. It's just crazy, especially now when we have, like, GPS. Like, I have a friend who uses GPS, like, everywhere, and I'm like, you know where it is. Why do you need GPS to go, like, fucking 3 miles away? And it's just habit. And now, like, to think these people were not navigators. They were just rich people who sat around and went to church and read things and thought about things, and here they are, like, in the middle of the desert, haggard and dying. It's just crazy. It blows my mind. Oh, and I thought I wrote to Daniel, who's my co-host on 33% Pulp, and I was like, this is like an analogy for the hubris of Western expansionism and, masculinity. They won't go back. They would not go back to Fort Bridger. They would not go back because it would be embarrassing, right? That they failed. In some ways, like, yeah, that story is like that they failed, that the land got the better of them,
Oh, yeah.
A lot of Western stories are like, oh, we can do this, and we did it, and we got this land or whatever the fuck. And now this particular story is like, oh, and then they ate each other. And we're buried in the snow.
It would have been less embarrassing. Like, they would have all survived if they would have gone back, and it would have been less embarrassing because they would not be known to history as such a failure. Like, so the fact that they were having too much toxic masculinity and being like, we're not going back, we're not asking for directions, is exactly why they're known to history.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah. And I think it's so funny that Tamsin Donner in the beginning, she was like, oh, the hardest part isn't starting,
Yeah.
Which is such a cliche now. And sometimes a lot of times I suppose it's true, but, in that particular case, I don't think it was.
Linzi, thank you for your wonderful story. You want to tell everybody where to find you and your wonderful podcast?
Sure. And thank you for having me again. Thanks for letting me talk into your ears. Yeah, my podcast, 33% Pulp, should be available wherever. I don't think we're on Spotify yet, unfortunately, but we are on Apple Podcasts and every other podcast app. On social media, I'm mostly active on Twitter at 33_Pulp, and on Instagram, we're at 33Pulp. We do have a Facebook page, but I rarely check it, so please don't actually go there.
Thank you for listening to The Cult of Domesticity. We are available on all podcatchers. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter at The Domestic Podcast, and Instagram at The Cult of Domesticity. If you have a topic request, information, or want to send us a recipe, please email us at thedomesticpodcast@gmail.com. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe and share with all your friends. Remember to stay domestic and cult-free.